Hello, welcome to Digital Badge Academy's latest webcast. I'm Jim Daniels, your co-host today, here along with fellow co-host David Leaser, and we're going to do something a little bit different today. This is not going to be the typical kind of webcast. David and I have sort of picked a topic at random, and not so much random, but we picked a topic that we haven't really spent a lot of time trying to plan for. We're just going to have an open conversation and discussion about it. And it's around all the discussion and what's emerging around CLR, Comprehensive Learner Record, and LER, Learning and Employment Records. So David, want to add to that at all?
Yeah, no. Well, here's the deal, is I think that most people don't understand what the difference is. In fact, even the people that are creating these standards have a hard time articulating what the difference is. And so what Jim has done is Jim has gone through and spent hours reading through everything from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce pages, the One Ed Tech pages from other different groups all throughout the globe to try to say, how do we distill this down to what it actually is so it makes sense for you? And so, Jim, why don't we start off with that? I mean, basically, what was the problem that created this need in the first place?
Well, I think when we talk about CLR standards and LER, which is not a standard, by the way, I think that the core reason why all of this started to emerge is really being driven more from the academic side of things. I think that's kind of the core of where it got started at. If you think about the traditional college transcript, and you look at the format and how that is structured and how it's managed by higher education, it's not very useful for a college graduate or a student that's getting close to graduating, or an employer. It's very cryptic. It's very codified. I think college transcripts, in terms of what they're in service of, it's restricted to the college or university that actually generates them, right? So it's very hard to make any sense of a college transcript, to really understand what someone knows, what they can do, what maybe they've mastered, what experiences that they've had throughout their college years. And that's where CLR and LER kind of, I think about where those kinds of concepts and standards started. I think it started kind of around that.
I think that, it's interesting because I remember Mike King, who was general manager of IBM Education years ago, held up an envelope that he'd gotten, and it said, "Do not open." It's like this sealed envelope, and it had his college transcript in it. And talk about not very transparent. I mean, literally what it is right, like you said, it is relatively relegated to the college system or the university system, where it's just being transferred from one place to another. It certainly isn't a portfolio of your accomplishments or achievements or your learning or your skills.
Not at all, right? And today, we both have been at a college for quite some time, and if you wanted to go and get a copy of your transcript, what an ordeal that can be.
Yeah.
Plus, you better, get your wallet out, because you're going to need some money to get it as well.
And then what do you do with it?
So here you've spent all this money on a college education with all these achievements, completing all these courses and that, and you get your transcript when you graduate. But then after the fact, if for some reason you did need it, if an employer wanted to see it, or there was some other reason for needing to produce a copy, then you had to go back and get a new copy of it because you lost your old one or whatever. It's almost silly.
It doesn't fit our modern. It doesn't fit our modern needs at all. Right. And so so the U.S. Chamber of Commerce comes out now, right, with this whole LER project. So what's that all about?
Well, learning and employment records, it is something that's being driven primarily by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. In fact, there is a resource. It's called the LER Hub. So if you just I'll put the URL actually up here. So if you follow this URL and go out, you'll find a website that it has more information than you could possibly imagine about LERs. But let me explain what an LER is, and I'll literally read word for word how the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation defines it. A learning and employment record is a digital record of learning and work that can be grouped together with other individual LERs for use in describing their abilities when pursuing education and employment opportunities. An LER can document learning wherever it occurs, including at the workplace or through an education experience, credentialing, or military training. It can also include information about employee history and even earnings. So that's how, and they go on to talk about how it's similar to electronic health records, or EHRs, like we're so familiar with now when we go to the doctor. Everything has been, put into digital format from a health record standpoint. So that's how they define it. And obviously the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is coming at this not just with an academic perspective, but basically just an overall workforce perspective, to empower workers or potential candidates for employment with a way of being able to better and more effectively articulate what they know and what they can do, what they've mastered, what experiences they've had that would help them get a job, right? And then, of course, if you think about LERs beyond that, it's not just about getting a job. LERs should, and I think will at some point, also factor into, how you go about keeping your job, right?
Right.
Professional development, or
and moving up in the company. It could be used for, everything from career placement to career advancement and resource planning and everything else. So it's really not a standard. And I think a lot of people think LER is a standard.
It is not. No, it's not a standard at all. It's more of an approach or a concept or a methodology, if you will. And it actually, there are a lot of things that can actually serve as an LER. A traditional college transcript is an LER, right? If you have a credential that is, I'll call it a CLR compliant credential. CLR is a standard that has been developed by One EdTech. And again, CLR is a standard. So if you've created a credential and it's compliant with those CLR standards, that can be a learning and employment.
Is a digital badge an LER?
As far as I'm concerned, it is. Now, if you go through and you look at the LER Hub, they do list a range of different kinds of data types, I think is how they define it, as qualifying as an LER. Interestingly enough, digital badges, and I'll say digital badges that are compliant with the open badges standards, are not listed there. I think that's odd. It may just be an oversight. I don't know. But as far as I'm concerned, absolutely, right? A digital badge, quite frankly, whether it's compliant with open badge standards or not, it's a potentially a learning and employment record, right?
What's a CLR then?
So CLR is comprehensive learner record, and it is a set of technical standards that define how data is to be structured in creation of a credential. Now, I'll tell you, in this case, CLR absolutely is being, in terms of how that got momentum behind it, is driven more from the academic side of things, rethinking the traditional college transcript and coming up with a better way to define the achievements of a student throughout the course of their college and university experience, right? But CLRs don't end there. CLRs, in terms of the standard, could be applied well beyond that. So it could have employment-related achievements, learning achievements. But again, it's a comprehensive learner record. So whether or not that standard can or will ever apply in cases like I mentioned earlier, an LER is something that could even potentially contain employment history and salary information. I don't know, and I literally don't know if the CLR standard is structured in a way to capture those kinds of elements as well. I'll just plead ignorance on that. But the key thing is it is a standard. It's a set of specifications that define or that govern how you define a learner record.
Right? In a way, it's kind of like, you think about it. If you think about it from like the smallest standard up through the LER, which is not a standard. If you have an open badge has standards for metadata. The metadata goes into certain fields, and that makes it very consumable, makes it very interoperable, and it also can lead to equivalence if you do it right with the right data. So you have the standard that says, okay, let's put the data in the right place in the record for this particular achievement itself, right? Or this accomplishment or whatever you want to call it. So you have that. That information then can flow into the CLR. And then the CLR is a bucket. Basically, it's a bigger portfolio in a way, right? That includes all of these different standardized pieces of information. And the CLR then provides its own standards to make sure that this data, again, is interoperable. And it can bring in transcripts and all this other stuff into the CLR that then now you have this bucket. So how does that relate to the LER then? I mean, does it end there? And does the CLR then, can it be defined as an LER?
Yeah, in a sense, you could say a CLR based credential is an LER, right? So some people say, well, CLRs are LERs. When I think of comprehensive learner record, the first thing that comes to my mind is it's a standard, right? It's a set of specifications. When I think of LER, I think of an actual record that is built based on something that's using CLR standards. But the reality is a CLR can be an LER. When we talk about LER, you can have an LER system, right, which is the aggregation of a whole bunch of learning and employment records that come together in one place. I'll give you an example of something that I think functions as an LER, and that is there's a company called Smart Resume that has come on the scene fairly recently. They've got a pretty outstanding system that's able to ingest a lot of different data in the form of badges and other types of formats of digital records about someone's learning experiences, their education experiences, work experiences, and that. And I see something like that as an LER ecosystem or an LER platform or an LER system. Then you can talk about LERs in a singular way as an individual record, right? And so when you talk about LER as an individual record and you talk about CLR as a record and not a standard, you're really talking about the exact same thing.
Right?
So the two terms end up being interchangeable. That also creates a little bit of confusion. So you have to, it's kind of like when the open badge standards were developed, right? We called badges open badges. Eventually, we've moved away from that. You rarely see these days anybody refer to a digital badge as an open badge. It'll either be digital badge or digital credential, right? But that's based on the open badges standards.
Right. That's the underlying technology that makes
that's how the story has shifted in the narrative and how you describe it. We're kind of caught in the same situation now with terms like CLR and LER. In the case of CLR, it's both a standard and it's a form of credential. So I could say I have a CLR that I want to pull into this portfolio that I'm using to gather up everything that I've accomplished, all my achievements, learning records, etc. Or I can talk about CLR in the context of the standards. And I think at some point it ends up. I think that creates a little bit of confusion. I think so in terms of telling the story. You have to make that distinction. Are you talking about standards? Are you specifications? Or are you talking about an actual record of what you've learned, right? And that's why I like the flow of saying CLR is a set of specifications and a standard that an LER can take advantage of.
So where is this going to go? I mean, it sounds like there's a push from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to start to,
Big push.
get people to standardize information using learner employment records. And then they're endorsing, or not really endorsing, but they're certainly listing and promoting a lot of these different groups that have standards-based learner employment records. I mean, that could be the transcript, or that could be the CLR, that could be the case standard that One Ed Tech has, all these different standards. So they're doing their part to say, let's promote this stuff. But where does this ultimately, where does the rubber hit the road on this thing? Where is it going? And is it starting to, what's it going to take to make this thing happen?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, let me say that the work, there's just been this Herculean level of work that's gone into all of this, right? So I want to make that point very clear. And CLR standards are, I mean, they're top drawer. There's no question. I think one of the first areas of benefit will hopefully be in the academic space with the reinventing and rethinking the college transcript. And CLR can play a huge role in that. So that to me is low-hanging fruit, right? As long as you get higher education to step up and agree that the traditional transcript is really it's not getting the job done. It's just not getting the job done. I think the other side of it, where all of this is going, is if you think about how the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is coming at it, they're thinking about they're coming at it obviously beyond just the notion that this is something that can benefit college students. They're thinking about what the 70% of people who finish high school and don't go to college, as an example. People that are in the military, get out of the military and need to go find work in the private sector. So they're making a big push behind this to create a smarter and more intelligent and more effective way for not just college students to have a rich record of all these things they've achieved and accomplished and skills and everything, but those that don't go through college, those who might have to find employment through other alternative kinds of learning pathways. So if you think of the LER work that's going on and what the Chamber of Commerce is pushing, the first place actually that I think we're seeing evidence of this, by the way, is and I think you just posted something on LinkedIn about this. There's, I think now 21 states that have dropped the requirement for degrees for a lot of the state jobs that exist. So if you drop degree requirements, then what's the alternative for capturing what you're learning along the way, ultimately to getting yourself in a position to be able to get one of those jobs?
Maybe. Yeah, and the trust part of it too, right? I mean, that's the other issue, is that can this become trusted the same way that the transcript's trusted, even though you have, depends on what study you look at, 80% or something like that of employers saying they don't think that college students are prepared for the workforce. That was part of the Eastern study. But at least it's trusted. Right,
it's trusted, but it doesn't communicate much, right?
Yeah, right. It doesn't communicate much, but it is trusted. So
it validates that I went to college, and
it validates that you went, and these are the dates you went, and these
courses, and I got these
courses you took, or whatever else it is, or you get as the degree you got. It's typically a macro level discussion.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see if there's a government push on this as well.
Well, and if you think of things like, and again, my mindset around this is I'm working primarily with employers in the consulting that I do. And I get these questions about, hey, do we need to be thinking about the CLR stuff and the LER stuff? And, and then what ensues following that question is an attempt to try and educate them and get them to understand what all that's really in service of and where it sits on the maturity curve and everything else. And then at the end of that conversation, typically they're back to status quo and they're leveraging digital badges just like they
Right.
always have, right? I would love to see us get to a point to where it's, there are ways to take advantage of these emerging new methods and standards and things in the employer side of the world.
Well, it's going to take to do that, though. It's going to take, well, first of all, people have to unhook from what they're already doing. And second, they have to see it as essential. And I'm not sure that they see it as essential at this point. And I think that there's a lot of messaging and marketing work that needs to be done from the these CLR groups. And I know there are companies like Territorium that are coming on board, and they're going to be they're the types of people. The commercial side of it's probably going to be the ones that are going to help push this forward.
Yeah, exactly. And that's like one of the first, I think, probably, to my knowledge, maybe the first commercial availability of CLR-based solutions for credentialing is the work that Territorium is doing. And then there are other standards out there sometimes you don't even hear about. There's the whole rich skill descriptor piece. Edelex is a company that's behind that. And to me, that's something that has a lot of promise. But, and can obviously translate and feed the LER system as well. But yeah, it's the story is, and even I struggle to tell the story, right? And I sit and I just read and pour through this stuff. It's an acronym and definition salad today. Again, I'm not taking anything away from all of the incredible work that's going on around it. It's not easy stuff.
It's confusing, and it's not. Again, when I was working on developing the storyline for the smarter workforce at IBM, which was a new category.
Yeah.
One of the things I learned, was that you make the market, because this is a new market. You have to make the market, and then you take the market.
Right.
So you make the market, you take the market, and there are very specific steps to making a market. And that's one thing that IBM knows how to do. What all the large companies do.
Yeah.
But I think they have to employ that strategy for how do I make this market, and then I can take the market. And making the market is, basically the influencers. It's the diffusion of innovation curve. Is how do you get to those influencers up front, and what kind of message are you going to give it to them that's going to compel people to say, this is something that I have to have. I mean, people don't really need to have, 1,000, songs in their pocket, right? Which is, I forget what the term was that Apple used for that. But they were convinced that they did. They were convinced that they have to have 1,000 songs in their pocket. You don't really need that. That wasn't really essential. But people now think it is essential. They think their phone, their smartphone has become essential. And so how do you make this thing essential?
Yeah, definitely. And I think too, and this is kind of funny because I created a post out on LinkedIn within the last week, and I wanted to create the simplest comparison between CLR and LER that I could come up with. And it was based off everything that I'd poured through and read. And I tried to distill that down into, something that you could read through in under 5 minutes. And it met with, some disapproval, quite frankly. And I think one of the areas where there was disapproval was the analogy that I chose. I looked at CLR and I said, well, that's the engine, right? And I said, and LER is the vehicle. So I think of LER as that actual record, right? The thing you're going to be able to lean on, that's going to help move you, forward in whatever pursuits you're engaged in, whether it's getting a job, keeping your job, or getting a better job, right? And that CLR is the specifications that underlie that make that work in a effective way. But that analogy, didn't necessarily resonate with some people. It did others, it didn't some. Another analogy that I've seen made is CLR is like the file and LER is like the folder, right? I don't know what analogy is the best one. I just know that there's still a lot of misunderstanding, and I'm still learning this stuff myself and trying to make sense of it and come up with the right kind of storyline around it and to be able to articulate all this in an effective way. I think it will mature. What it's all intended to be in service of and the bigger picture and the bigger vision behind all of this is absolutely rock solid sound, no question. But I think for it to get out of the lab and onto the shelf is going to require some commercial investment, just like we saw with the open badges standards and digital badges, right?
That's it. That's exactly when we did the open badge program at IBM. No other company was planning to do that, really.
There were a handful,
certainly not at that scale.
It was. I mean, it was a ghost town of lawyers.
Nobody saw the value. Even within the IBM company, people were saying, "I don't see the value," and that was part of making the market. We had to make the market even internally at IBM to sell the IBM badge program to internal stakeholders.
Yeah, exactly. Because from an employer standpoint, there's two ways you could take advantage of this whole CLR LER movement, I'll call it. Obviously, in recruiting and hiring efforts, to be able to have a way to ingest these records. And again, if we're talking LERs, we're talking records that could come through that are aligned to a whole bunch of different standards, right? Because LER is not a standard. It is not a standard. It is a concept. It's a methodology, if you will. But at the same time, there are standards like CLR and open badge standards and others. So an employer that's doing recruiting and hiring and they want to be able to ingest all these different credentials in these different forms as learning and employment records, they need to be able to ingest that and make some sense of it. And so what are those solutions that sit at that point from the perspective of an employer? What are the solutions that plug into their HR stack, the talent, the recruiting and talent management side of thing? And boy, that's pretty barren territory right there. So I think that's going to have to be resolved. And then there's how employers leverage it strictly internally for ongoing professional development of employees.
And that's going to take change. That's a job to get the HR organizations to adopt this. It's going to have to be faster, cheaper, better than what they already have.
Yeah, because if I've worked somewhere for 5 years and I've been earning records, today, it's basically like if we think about like an IBM, for instance, I'm earning all these badges and I have this whole portfolio of badges in my Credly portfolio, or my digital credentials wallet, wherever they sit, right? If I leave that employer and I take those records with me, in what format are they? So it's
interesting times ahead. So if people want to find out more, what's the best place, the one single place that leads to all the answers?
Well, I'm going to say there's two places. So one is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, and it's the LER Hub. I would suggest starting there. And I'm putting the link up right now that people can follow. It's really well done. It is absolutely an overwhelming amount of information. So, there may be limits to how deep you want to go, but if anything and everything you'd ever want to know about LERs, you're going to find there, point blank. In terms of CLR, One EdTech is responsible for having developed those standards. So, and I'll put the link up here for One EdTech specifically for where the information about CLR can be found. And I'd suggest going there to read all about CLR. Again, as you read further and further into the information they have, it eventually gets right down into the specifications themselves. So that may not be of interest to you, but you can at least understand, what's behind CLR. And I think when you put the two together, it begins to make more sense when you reference those two resources. That's at least been my approach. But so those are the two best resources.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, and we'll see how this standard takes shape and how the whole idea of LER starts to diffuse. It'll be interesting ride.
Yeah, it will be. And, it gives us lots to talk about, think about going forward.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Are you looking to launch a digital badging program or improve an existing one? Look no further than Digital Badge Academy. Our highly popular online masterclass will help you gain the skills and insights necessary to achieve success. Enroll now and start learning today.